There's a moment in every person's life when they have to choose between speaking up or staying silent. For Maria Santos, that moment came on a cold Tuesday morning in March 2023, inside a sprawling mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. She was 34 years old, a single mother of two, and she'd been working as a housekeeper for the Hammond family for almost 3 years. That morning, she discovered something that would change everything. Not just for her, but for one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. What she found hidden in a locked drawer wasn't just evidence of financial crimes worth over $40 million. It was proof that the golden family everyone admired was built on lies, manipulation, and something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And when she tried to do the right thing, the family's 23-year-old daughter, Madison Hammond, made a decision that would land her in court, destroy her family's empire, and turn Maria into a symbol of courage that millions of people would rally behind. But before any of that happened, there was the slap heard around the nation. This is the true story of privilege, power, and the price one woman paid for telling the truth. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. Let me take you back to where it all began. Greenwich, Connecticut, is one of the wealthiest towns in America. Hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, and old money families live behind iron gates and manicured lawns that stretch for acres. The Hammond family was royalty in this world. Robert Hammond, age 58, had built his fortune in pharmaceutical investments. His company, Hammond Capital Group, managed over $3 billion in assets. His wife, Patricia, came from old Connecticut money and spent her days on charity boards and yacht club committees. And then there was Madison, their only child. Beautiful, educated at Yale, with over 200,000 Instagram followers who watched her jet-set lifestyle with envy. She posted photos from Paris, Tokyo, the Maldives. She wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and to the outside world she seemed perfect. Poised, philanthropic, the kind of young woman who had everything and appreciated nothing, though no one dared say it out loud. Maria Santos's life couldn't have been more different. She'd immigrated from Brazil 12 years earlier with dreams of giving her children opportunities she never had. Her daughter, Sophia, was 16 and wanted to be a doctor. Her son, Lucas, was 13 and loved basketball more than anything in the world. Maria worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, cleaning the Hammond mansion from top to bottom. She scrubbed floors, organized closets, prepared meals, and did it all with a quiet dignity that her children admired. She never complained, even when Madison would leave clothes scattered across her bedroom floor, demand that Maria redo tasks that were already perfect. Even when Patricia would inspect her work with white gloves, literally, checking for dust on surfaces that Maria had cleaned 3 times already. Maria needed this job. It paid well, better than most housekeeping positions, and the Hammonds had promised to help with Sophia's college applications. So she stayed quiet. She smiled when they were rude. She apologized when they were wrong. She made herself invisible, which is exactly what wealthy people want from their staff, to be there when needed and disappear when not. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first sign that something was wrong came in January 2023, about 2 months before everything fell apart. Maria was cleaning Robert Hammond's home office, a room she wasn't usually allowed to enter. But Patricia had specifically asked her to dust and vacuum while Robert was away on business in Singapore. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a billionaire. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Long Island Sound. Modern art on the walls worth more than Maria would earn in her lifetime. A massive mahogany desk with 3 computer monitors, and filing cabinets that were always locked. Maria was dusting the bookshelf when she noticed one of the filing cabinet drawers wasn't completely closed. It was slightly ajar, maybe half an inch, like someone had been in a hurry and hadn't pushed it shut properly. She walked over and pushed it closed, or tried to. Something was blocking it from inside. She pulled the drawer open just enough to see what was causing the jam, and that's when she saw the folders. Dozens of them, all marked with red labels that said, "Confidential internal only." She knew she shouldn't look. Every instinct told her to close the drawer and walk away. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way Robert had been acting lately, taking phone calls in hushed tones and leaving the house at odd hours. Maybe it was the argument she'd overheard between him and Patricia about money, about investigations, about keeping quiet, or maybe it was just curiosity. She pulled out one folder, just one, and opened it. What she saw made her stomach drop. Bank statements showing wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, invoices for medical equipment that was never delivered, email printouts discussing something called ghost billing and insurance fraud. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. This wasn't normal business. This was illegal. She quickly closed the folder, shoved it back into the drawer, and pushed the drawer shut properly this time. Her hands were shaking. She finished cleaning the office as fast as she could and didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Not her children, not her sister, not even her closest friend. She convinced herself it wasn't her business. She was just the housekeeper. What would she even do with that information? Who would believe her over a billionaire? So she tried to forget about it. She went back to her routine, cleaning, cooking, staying invisible. But she couldn't stop thinking about those folders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the Hammond family wasn't just wealthy, they were hiding something dangerous. The breaking point came on March 14th, 2023. It was a Tuesday, unusually cold for mid-March, with temperatures barely above freezing. The Hammonds were hosting a brunch for Patricia's charity board, about 15 women who spent more on their handbags than Maria earned in 6 months. Maria had been up since 5 in the morning preparing, fresh flowers in every room, gourmet pastries from a bakery in Manhattan, coffee in china cups that cost $300 each. Everything had to be perfect. Patricia had made that very clear. Madison had come home the night before from a weekend in Miami with friends, and she was in a foul mood. She'd been fighting with her boyfriend, some finance guy named Trevor, and she'd been drinking since she landed. By the time the brunch started at 11, she was already on her third mimosa and snapping at everyone around her. Maria was in the kitchen, refilling coffee carafes, when Madison stormed in. She grabbed a cup from the counter and held it out without even looking at Maria, expecting it to be filled immediately. Maria poured the coffee carefully, but Madison jerked her hand at the last second, and some of the hot liquid splashed onto her cream-colored Gucci blouse. For a moment, everything went silent. Madison looked down at the stain spreading across her chest, and then she looked up at Maria with pure rage in her eyes. The slap came so fast Maria didn't have time to react. It wasn't just a slap. It was violent, hard enough to snap Maria's head to the side and make her stumble backward into the kitchen counter. The coffee carafe fell from her hands and shattered on the marble floor. Maria's cheek burned, her eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from humiliation. And then Madison started screaming. Not at Maria specifically, but at the situation, at the universe, at whatever had made her life feel so out of control in that moment. The entire house heard it. The charity board women in the dining room fell silent mid-conversation. Patricia came rushing into the kitchen, her face tight with embarrassment. Not concern. Robert appeared moments later from his office, his expression unreadable, and Madison kept screaming, calling Maria careless, stupid, worthless. She said things I won't repeat here, things that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. Maria stood there, hand pressed to her burning cheek, surrounded by shattered porcelain and spilled coffee, and she realized something in that moment. She realized that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, to people like Madison Hammond, she would never be fully human. She would always be the help, invisible until she made a mistake, and then suddenly very, very visible. One of the charity board members, a woman named Diane Chen, who would later become a key witness, had her phone out. She'd been recording a video message for her daughter when the screaming started, and she'd kept recording. The whole thing was captured on video. Madison's rage, the slap, Maria's shock and tears, and most importantly, Robert and Patricia's reaction, or rather, their lack of reaction. They didn't comfort Maria. They didn't reprimand Madison. Patricia simply told Maria to clean up the mess and take the rest of the day off. Robert ushered Madison out of the kitchen like she was the victim in all of this, and the brunch continued as if nothing had happened. Maria left through the back entrance, the one the staff always used, and she sat in her 12-year-old Honda Civic in the parking area for 20 minutes, crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. She thought about her children. She thought about the bills she had to pay. She thought about the fact that she was 34 years old and still being treated like she didn't matter. And then she thought about those folders in Robert Hammond's office. She made a decision right there in that parking lot. She wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. Not about the slap, and not about what she'd discovered in that filing cabinet. She started her car and drove home to her small apartment in Stamford, 40 minutes away, and she called the one person she thought might actually listen. Her cousin, Eduardo, who worked as a paralegal for a civil rights attorney in New Haven. She told him everything. The slap, the folders, the offshore accounts, all of it. Eduardo listened carefully and then said something that would change the course of everything that followed. He said Maria needed to get evidence. Real evidence, not just her word against theirs. He said if she could get photos or copies of those documents, he could connect her with people who could actually do something about it. Federal investigators, journalists, lawyers who specialized in whistleblower cases, but she had to move fast, because once the Hammond family realized what she knew, they would do everything in their power to silence her. Maria didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her children breathing in the next room, and she wrestled with the biggest decision of her life. Going back to that house meant risk. Real risk. The Hammonds were powerful people with powerful lawyers and powerful friends. They could destroy her life with a single phone call. They could have her deported, even though she was here legally. They could make sure she never worked in Greenwich again. But doing nothing meant letting them get away with everything. The fraud, the cruelty, the belief that they were untouchable. And Maria had spent 12 years in this country watching people like the Hammonds face zero consequences for their actions, while people like her struggled just to survive. She decided she was done being invisible. The next morning, Wednesday, March 15th, Maria texted Patricia and said she was ready to come back to work. She apologized for leaving abruptly, even though she had nothing to apologize for, and asked if she could make up the hours she'd missed. Patricia responded within minutes, clearly relieved. She said Madison had been under a lot of stress and hadn't meant to lose her temper. She offered Maria a $500 bonus as a gesture of goodwill, which they both knew was really hush money. Maria accepted. She showed up Thursday morning at 6 as usual, and she waited for her opportunity. The opportunity came that Friday afternoon. Robert was in Manhattan for meetings. Patricia had a tennis lesson at the country club, and Madison was upstairs in her room recovering from another late night out, sleeping off a hangover with her door closed and her phone on silent. Maria had the house to herself. The security system was active, which meant cameras in the hallways and entrances, but she'd worked in this house long enough to know where the blind spots were. The home office was on the first floor at the back of the house, away from the main living areas. She'd memorized Robert's routine. He kept the filing cabinet keys in the top drawer of his desk, hidden inside a leather portfolio. She'd seen him access them before when she was cleaning. Her hands shook as she unlocked the office door with the master key Patricia had given her for cleaning purposes. She moved quickly to the desk, found the keys exactly where she expected them to be, and unlocked the filing cabinet. There were 6 drawers total. She started with the one she'd accidentally seen before, the one marked Confidential Internal Only. She pulled out her phone and started taking photos. Bank statements showing transfers totaling over $40 million to shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore, Invoices for medical equipment purchased through Hammond Capital Group's pharmaceutical investments but never delivered to the hospitals and clinics that supposedly ordered them. Email chains between Robert and his business partners discussing how to manipulate insurance claims and Medicare billing. Documents showing kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies in exchange for preferential investment recommendations. And most damning of all, a spreadsheet tracking what they called recovery payments, which were actually bribes paid to accountants and auditors to look the other way. Maria photographed everything. Her phone's camera shutter sounded impossibly loud in the quiet office. Every few minutes she'd stop and listen for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that someone was coming. But the house stayed silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on Robert's desk. She moved through all 6 drawers systematically, photographing hundreds of pages of documents. Her phone's storage was nearly full by the time she finished. She carefully put everything back exactly as she'd found it, locked the filing cabinets, returned the keys to the desk drawer, and left the office. The entire operation took 47 minutes. It felt like hours. She went back to her regular duties, cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, preparing dinner, as if nothing had happened. But inside, her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. That evening, she met Eduardo at a coffee shop in Stamford and showed him everything. He scrolled through the photos on her phone, his eyes getting wider with each image. He said this was bigger than he'd imagined. This wasn't just fraud. This was systematic, organized criminal activity involving millions of dollars and potentially affecting thousands of patients who'd been billed for equipment they never received. He made some calls right there in the coffee shop, speaking in hushed tones to people Maria couldn't see. Within an hour, they had a meeting set up for Monday morning with a federal prosecutor and an investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Maria went home that night feeling terrified and exhilarated at the same time. She'd done it. She had evidence. She had a way to hold the Hammond family accountable, but she also knew the next few days would be the most dangerous of her life. She spent the weekend with her children, taking them to the park, making their favorite meals, trying to act normal even though everything had changed. Sophia noticed something was different. She asked her mother if everything was okay at work, if something had happened. Maria smiled and told her everything was fine, that she was just tired. She didn't want to worry her children until she knew what was going to happen next. She didn't want them to be afraid. But Maria was afraid. She was terrified, because she knew that once the Hammonds found out what she'd done, there would be consequences. She just didn't know how severe those consequences would be. Monday morning came, and Maria met with federal investigators in a nondescript office building in New Haven. There were 3 of them: Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, SEC investigator Marcus Thompson, and an FBI agent named David Park who specialized in financial crimes. They spent 4 hours going through every photo Maria had taken. They asked her detailed questions about the Hammond family, their routines, who visited the house, what conversations she'd overheard. They explained that what she'd discovered was evidence of wire fraud, securities fraud, healthcare fraud, and money laundering. The charges could potentially lead to decades in prison for Robert Hammond and anyone else involved in the scheme. They told Maria she was incredibly brave, but also in potential danger. They offered her protection, witness security measures, legal representation. They said they'd move quickly to execute search warrants before the Hammonds could destroy any evidence. But they needed Maria to act normal for a few more days while they prepared their case. They needed her to go back to work like nothing had happened. She went back to the Hammond mansion Tuesday morning, March 21st, and everything seemed normal at first. Patricia was planning a dinner party. Robert was on conference calls in his office. Madison was at the gym with her personal trainer. Maria couldn't quite identify what it was, but the air felt charged somehow, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The explosion came Wednesday afternoon. Maria was cleaning the second-floor hallway when she heard shouting from downstairs. Robert's voice, louder than she'd ever heard it. Patricia's voice, shrill and panicked. And then Madison's voice, sharp and accusatory. Maria's blood went cold. They knew. Somehow, they knew. She started moving toward the back staircase, the one that led to the staff entrance, but before she could reach it, Madison appeared at the top of the main staircase. Her face was flushed with rage, and she was holding something in her hand, a printed email. "How did you think you'd get away with it?" Madison screamed. "You stupid, ungrateful thief. You went through private files. You took photos. You're going to prison, do you understand? You're going to lose everything." Maria's mind raced. How did they know? She'd been so careful. She hadn't told anyone except Eduardo and the investigators. The investigators had promised to keep everything confidential until the warrants were ready, but somehow the Hammonds knew. Later, Maria would learn that one of the SEC investigators had a connection to Hammond Capital Group through his wife's family. He'd tipped them off, violating federal protocol and destroying his own career in the process. But in that moment, Maria just knew she was in danger. Robert appeared behind Madison, his face cold and calculating in a way that was somehow more frightening than his daughter's rage. He spoke quietly, his voice controlled but laced with menace. "You've made a serious mistake, Maria, breaking into private files, stealing confidential business documents. That's corporate espionage. That's a federal crime. We have lawyers who will make sure you spend the next 10 years in prison. Your children will grow up without a mother. Is that what you want?" Maria felt her legs go weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. She thought about her children. She thought about all the patients who'd been defrauded by this family's greed, and she found her voice. "I didn't steal anything. I documented evidence of crimes you committed. The federal government already has everything. They're coming for you, not me." The look on Robert's face changed from calculated confidence to genuine fear, just for a second, before the mask slipped back into place. But Madison lost control completely. She lunged forward, and for a moment Maria thought she was going to be hit again. But this time, Patricia stepped between them, not to protect Maria, but to protect her daughter from doing something that couldn't be undone. She grabbed Madison's arm and pulled her back, speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Not here. Not now. Think about what you're doing." What happened next was something Maria hadn't anticipated. Robert's demeanor changed completely. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He suggested they all sit down and discuss this rationally. He said there had obviously been a misunderstanding. He acknowledged that the company had been going through some accounting irregularities, but nothing criminal, just complex financial structures that looked suspicious to someone who didn't understand high-level investment banking. He said if Maria had concerns, she should have come to him directly instead of going to outside authorities. He was smooth, persuasive, and completely convincing. He offered Maria a settlement, $200,000, cash, if she'd sign a non-disclosure agreement and tell the investigators she'd been mistaken about what she'd seen. He said everyone would walk away clean. She could give her children the life she'd always dreamed of. Sophia could go to any college she wanted. Lucas could have every opportunity. All she had to do was say she'd misunderstood what she'd photographed. Maria felt the temptation pull at her. $200,000 was more money than she'd earn in 5 years of housekeeping. It could change everything for her family, but she also knew what it would cost. It would mean letting the Hammonds continue defrauding patients and investors. It would mean other families would suffer while the Hammond family grew richer. It would mean teaching her children that integrity has a price, and that price is whatever rich people are willing to pay. She looked Robert directly in the eyes and said no. She said she wasn't signing anything, and she wasn't changing her story, because it wasn't a story. It was the truth. And for the first time in 3 years of working in that house, she saw real fear in his eyes. The conversation ended abruptly. Robert told her she was fired, effective immediately. He said she had 10 minutes to gather her belongings and leave the property. Patricia added that they'd be filing a criminal complaint against her for theft and trespassing. Madison just stared at her with undisguised hatred. Maria left through the back door one final time, and as she drove away, she looked at the mansion in her rearview mirror and realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She'd stood up to them. She'd said no to their money and their threats, and she'd told the truth even though it would have been so much easier to take the payoff and stay quiet. She called Eduardo immediately and told him what had happened. He told her to go straight home and lock her doors. He said the investigators were accelerating their timeline. Search warrants would be executed within 24 hours. She needed to stay safe until this was over. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the confrontation in her mind, kept wondering if she'd made the right choice. She thought about her children sleeping in the next room, unaware of how drastically their lives were about to change. She wondered if they'd be safe, if the Hammonds would try to retaliate against them, if she'd put her family in danger by refusing to stay silent. But then, she remembered something her own mother had told her years ago in Brazil, before she'd passed away. She'd said that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when you're terrified. And Maria was terrified. But she was also determined to see this through. Thursday morning, March 23, 2023. Federal agents executed simultaneous search warrants at the Hammond Mansion, Robert's office in Manhattan, and the Hammond Capital Group headquarters in Stamford. Over 30 agents descended on each location with boxes, computers, and forensic accountants. They seized every computer, every filing cabinet, every phone. They brought in digital forensics teams to recover deleted files. They interviewed every employee, every business partner, every person who'd had contact with the Hammond family's financial operations. The scene at the mansion was something out of a movie. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway, agents in FBI windbreakers carrying out boxes of documents, news helicopters circling overhead after someone tipped off the media. Patricia stood on the front steps looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Madison was in the background, crying on the phone to her lawyer, and Robert was led out in handcuffs, his face carefully blank, revealing nothing. The photo of his arrest made the front page of every major newspaper in the country. The wealthy pharmaceutical investor arrested on fraud charges, the billionaire accused of stealing from hospitals, the philanthropist family exposed as criminals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This was the family that had donated millions to charity, that had their name on hospital wings and scholarship programs, and all of it had been funded by the very crimes they were now accused of committing. The investigation that followed uncovered even more than Maria had discovered. Robert Hammond and his partners had been running the scheme for over 8 years. They'd created fake medical equipment companies that existed only on paper. They'd billed Medicare and private insurance companies for devices that were never manufactured or delivered. They'd inflated prices on legitimate equipment and pocketed the difference. They'd paid kickbacks to hospital administrators and insurance adjusters to approve fraudulent claims. In total, they'd stolen over $63 million, and they'd used that money to fund their lavish lifestyle, the mansion, the cars, the private jets, Madison's shopping sprees in Paris and Tokyo, all of it built on stolen money that should have gone to patient care. The scheme had affected over 12,000 patients across 6 states. Some had been billed for equipment they never received. Others had received substandard equipment because the Hammonds had cut corners to increase profits. There were cases of patients who'd suffered complications because the medical devices they'd been given were cheap knockoffs instead of the FDA-approved equipment their doctors had ordered. The human cost of the Hammond family's greed was staggering, and it was all documented in the files Maria had photographed. The trial began 7 months later, in October 2023. Robert, Patricia, and Madison were all charged, though Patricia would eventually cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The documents Maria had photographed, the deleted files recovered by forensic investigators, testimony from employees who'd been pressured to falsify records, bank statements showing the offshore accounts. And through it all, Maria sat in the courtroom every single day. She testified for 6 hours over 2 days, describing what she'd found, how she'd gathered the evidence, and the threats she'd received from the Hammond family. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting she'd misunderstood what she'd seen, that she'd stolen the documents out of revenge after being fired, that she was working with the investigators to frame an innocent family. But Maria didn't break. She answered every question calmly and truthfully. She explained that she'd taken the photos because she believed patients deserved to know. They'd been defrauded. She said she'd gone to investigators because she believed in the system, even though that system had rarely worked in favor of people like her. And when Madison's lawyer asked her why she'd turned down the $200,000 settlement offer, Maria's answer silenced the entire courtroom. She said some things couldn't be bought, and the truth was one of them. She said her children deserved to grow up knowing their mother had integrity, and that was worth more than any amount of money the Hammonds could offer. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Robert Hammond was found guilty of wire fraud, securities fraud, healthcare fraud, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Madison Hammond was found guilty of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and assault. She was sentenced to 5 years, though she would end up serving 3 with good behavior. Patricia received 18 months in a minimum security facility after her cooperation with prosecutors. Hammond Capital Group was dismantled. The assets were seized and liquidated, with the proceeds going to restitution for the defrauded patients and insurance companies. The mansion was sold at auction. The cars, the art collection, the jewelry, everything was gone. The Hammond family's empire collapsed completely, and at the center of it all was Maria Santos, the housekeeper who'd refused to stay silent. The media coverage was intense. Maria became a national story, featured on 60 Minutes, profiled in the New York Times and Washington Post. People called her a hero, a whistleblower, a symbol of courage in the face of institutional corruption. Advocacy groups invited her to speak at conferences about workers' rights and corporate accountability. Politicians referenced her case when proposing whistleblower protection legislation. And, through it all, Maria remained humble. She didn't give many interviews. She didn't try to capitalize on her story. She just wanted to move forward with her life. But moving forward wasn't easy. The Hammond family's legal team had done exactly what Robert had threatened. They'd filed criminal complaints against Maria for theft and trespassing. Even though those charges were eventually dropped, the process was exhausting and expensive. Maria had to hire her own lawyer. She had to take time off from work for depositions and court appearances. She had to deal with harassment from Hammond supporters who believed she'd destroyed an innocent family. Someone leaked her address online, and she received death threats. She had to move her family to a different apartment for their safety. Her children struggled with the attention and the stress. Sophia had panic attacks before school. Lucas got into fights with classmates who'd seen their mother on TV and made comments. The price of doing the right thing was higher than Maria had ever imagined. There were moments when she wondered if it had been worth it, if she'd made the right choice, if she should have just taken the settlement money and stayed quiet. But then she'd think about the patients who'd been defrauded, the families who'd been lied to, the system that only worked when people like her were willing to speak up, and she knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. The happy ending, if you can call it that, came gradually. The federal government awarded Maria over $3 million through the False Claims Act, which allows whistleblowers to receive a portion of recovered funds in fraud cases. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of having. She used it to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood. She set up college funds for both her children. She donated $50,000 to a legal aid organization that helped immigrant workers facing exploitation. And she started working with a nonprofit that trained and supported whistleblowers, helping other people find the courage to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. Sophia graduated high school with honors and was accepted to Boston University on a pre-med track. She wants to be a doctor, partly because of what her mother went through, partly because she wants to help people the way her mother helped those defrauded patients. Lucas made his school's varsity basketball team and talks about maybe playing in college someday. He tells his friends his mom is the bravest person he knows. Maria went back to housekeeping, not because she had to financially, but because she liked the work. She found a position with a family in Norwalk who treats her with respect, pays her fairly, and values her not just as an employee but as a person. She works 4 days a week now instead of 6. She has time to attend her children's school events and basketball games. She has time to breathe. 3 years have passed since that cold Tuesday morning when Maria discovered those files in Robert Hammond's office. The Hammond mansion is now owned by a tech executive who knows nothing about the family who lived there before. Robert Hammond is in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, where he'll remain until he's 80 years old. Madison was released from prison last year and lives quietly in Boston, working at a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated women re-enter society. Some people think that's ironic. Others think it's the best thing that could have happened to her. Patricia moved to Florida to be near her sister and rarely speaks publicly about what happened. The story has faded from the headlines, as these stories always do, but the impact remains. The patients who were defrauded have received restitution. The system has been reformed, at least partially, with new oversight mechanisms to prevent similar fraud schemes. And Maria Santos is still here, still working, still raising her children, still living proof that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary power when they find the courage to do so. She doesn't consider herself a hero. She says she just did what anyone should do when they witness injustice. But the truth is, most people don't. Most people stay quiet. Most people take the settlement. Most people convince themselves that one person can't make a difference. Maria proved them wrong. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many times in your own life you've witnessed something wrong and stayed silent because speaking up felt too risky. Think about the small injustices you've seen at work, in your community, in your own family, and how often we all choose comfort over courage. I'm not saying everyone needs to blow the whistle on a $63 million fraud scheme, but I am saying that integrity matters, that speaking up matters, that refusing to be complicit matters. Maria Santos was a 34-year-old single mother who earned $14 an hour cleaning someone else's house. She had every reason to stay quiet. She had every reason to take the money and protect herself. But she chose differently. She chose to believe that truth was more valuable than safety. And because of that choice, thousands of people received justice they otherwise never would have gotten. A family of criminals faced consequences for their actions. And the system, however imperfectly, worked. Not because of powerful people or institutions, but because one woman refused to be invisible. So, I want to ask you something. If you were in Maria's position, what would you have done? Would you have taken the $200,000 and signed the non-disclosure agreement? Would you have gathered the evidence knowing it could destroy your life? Or would you have just walked away and pretended you'd never seen those files? There's no wrong answer here. I'm genuinely curious what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you think Maria made the right choice. Tell me if you would have done the same thing. And tell me about a time in your own life when you had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. Because I think we all have those moments, even if they're smaller in scale, and I think it's worth talking about. It's worth being honest about how hard it is to do the right thing sometimes, how much it costs, and whether the cost is worth it. And here's another question. Do you think Madison Hammond deserved a second chance? She served her time. She's trying to help other people now. Does that redeem her for what she did to Maria? Or are some actions unforgivable? Again, no wrong answers. I just think it's worth thinking about, because this story isn't really about one billionaire family and one housekeeper. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when no one's watching. It's about whether we believe in accountability or just talk about it. It's about whether we're willing to sacrifice comfort for integrity. And those are questions every single person has to answer for themselves. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it made you think, If it moved you, if it changed your perspective even a little bit, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage. And subscribe to this channel because we're dedicated to telling stories that matter, stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding the strength to do what's right. Next week, we're bringing you another story that will challenge everything you think you know about justice and redemption. It's about a teacher who discovered her principal was stealing from the school's special education fund, and what she did next cost her everything, but saved hundreds of children from being denied the resources they desperately needed. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember Maria's story. Remember that one person speaking the truth can change everything. Remember that integrity isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small choices we make every single day when we think no one's watching. And remember that you have more power than you think you do. The people who want you to stay quiet, the people who benefit from injustice, they're counting on you, believing you're powerless. Don't give them that satisfaction. Be like Maria. Speak up. Stand up. Tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking and your voice is trembling. Because that's how the world changes, one brave person at a time. I'll see you in the next one.